right, welcome everybody. This is our event on 20 years of war, coalitions of war and anti-war. And thank you to everybody who's tuning in through various channels to see this event on this important topic in this moment. I want to thank our co-sponsors today, the sponsor, the Einaudi Center for International Studies, as well as our co-sponsors, the American Studies Program and the ILR School at Cornell University, and our host, eCornell, which is powering this event. I want to acknowledge I'm coming from New York State, in a part of New York State that are the homelands of the Cayuga Nation. And this region and New York State have been the home of Native American and indigenous communities, past as well as present, enduring. They've also been a home of struggles between slavery and abolition, of self-emancipated people and people in solidarity with them over the 19th century and before and after. And these are struggles that we speak to today, the struggles of indigenous sovereignty and abolition, and how they speak to anti-racist struggles and other struggles for economic and global justice today. This particular event is part of a larger series called Class Race Global. You can tune in on Twitter, Class Race Global, and we'll be doing other events going into next year. These two events are about 20 years of war. We'll have other events about history and politics, bringing together scholars, journalists, and activists on topics like labor movements, feminist movements, movements facing criminal justice and racial justice, linking class, race, and global, linking issues of importance within the US as well as multiple other locales. These two events are focused on 20 years of war. We had a great event last week with Adam Hania, Rachel Hertzing, Richard Seymour, Rosina Ali, and myself, and we have a wonderful panel today. I would encourage any of you to check out the recording on eCornell of last week's event, and we have a fantastic panel today. We're having this event on December 7th, 2021. Some of you know the significance. 80 years ago, when Imperial Japan attacked Hawaii and other sites in the Pacific, Pearl Harbor and elsewhere, which was the precipitating event for the US formal entrance into World War II. And this was a moment, 1940, 41, 42, when US global power was projected in a way that would prove to be historic, in ways where a permanent and massive militarization took shape over the 1940s, and also the notion of national security was articulated in ways that would transform every region of the world and also every aspect of domestic life in the United States. My name is Tejasvi Nagaraja, Tej Nagaraja. I'm a historian here at Cornell University in the ILR School. And my own research, I'm writing a book about World War II and the links between race, class, and global, between Black freedom, labor struggle, struggles over criminal justice, and the way they took shape in that war machine as US empire was being projected globally and domestically. And in my research and teaching and in events like these, I look at all periods, including the present day, and those class, race, global links in realms of war and otherwise. And we have a really fantastic panel today with Anand Gopal, who is a journalist who's written and reported from Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria in the New York Times, in the New Yorker, and elsewhere, and who's won many awards for his book, No Good Men Among the Living, about Afghanistan. He's also now writing a book about Syria, and you can check out his reporting in the New Yorker and the New York Times and elsewhere. We have Judith LeBlanc, who's been a longtime organizer and activist in Native and Indigenous sovereignty movements, in anti-war and peace movements, and a host of other social movements across the United States and globally, who brings those perspectives of overlapping and intersecting social movements to analyzing war and anti-war. We have Lyle Jeremy Rubin, who has both a lived experience in the US Marine Corps in different locales, including in Afghanistan in 2010, and who's also done his own writing and research as a historian, an intellectual, a creative writer in magazines, and is working on a book building off of some of that writing about both his personal experience in the Marine Corps in Afghanistan and also a broader analysis of militarism, masculinity, and these larger questions. And we have Samar Al-Baluchi, professor at University of California, Irvine, who's looking at the global war on terror with a focus on East Africa and the Horn of Africa, sites like Kenya, Somalia, and neighboring lands there, which has a different perspective on a US-led war on terror, but a multipolar, multi-layered war with protagonists in the African continent as well as elsewhere. So this is a really robust conversation, and I'm going to ask everybody to think about coalitions of war and anti-war, right? Political coalitions, economic coalitions, coalitions of elites and ordinary people, and how war affects not only foreign policy when we're thinking about foreign policy, or war when we're thinking about it, but other aspects of life, economic well-being, livelihood opportunities, whether for working class people or middle class people in Kenya, or landless people or farmers in Afghanistan, or rural or urban working class, middle class people in the United States. And we can see the parallels, the asymmetries, and all of that. So thank you so much. And I'll just get a couple of housekeeping notes. If you have any questions, you can put them into the chat. There's a dialogue box at the top right of your video player, and I won't be able to work them all in, but I'll do my best. And if it's directed to a specific speaker, you can do that. And this event is being recorded, so you can view it at this URL afterwards or share it with other people. So let's jump right into our discussion. And Anand, you know, we're now here 20 years into the war. That has been called the global war on terror. And what are some of the key points that you want to make for our big picture story, our big picture analysis? You've done reporting in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Syria. So reflecting on your experience, and also what should we know for this bigger conversation?
Thanks, Tej. I think the most important thing right now is considering 20 years of war. It's very easy to look at the U.S. withdrawal in Afghanistan and think that the period of forever wars is over. Actually, it's a bit more complicated than that. Just looking first at Afghanistan. So U.S. troops have withdrawn entirely, but what's also happened is that the United States and other major world powers have essentially frozen all of the funds that are meant to go to Afghanistan. So this is basically money for basic social services that have been frozen. So right now, Afghanistan is facing a pretty acute economic crisis, humanitarian crisis that's probably the most gravest in the entire planet. And what's essentially happening is that the US and other allied powers are punishing ordinary Afghans for the fact that the Taliban have taken over the country, because there's sanctions being put on the country, there's no money going in, and all of this is putatively targeted at the leadership of the country, but it's ordinary Afghans who are suffering. So there's really horrific images that are coming out now of severe malnutrition. There are, when I was on the ground a couple of months ago, just after the Taliban took over, you would see in Kabul people who are just on the streets selling all their household furniture, trying to do anything they can to make ends meet. It's a pretty tragic situation, and it's kind of continuing the war against Afghan people by other means. And the other way that's, I think, important in how this war is continuing, and I'm sure Samar can talk about how it's continuing in East Africa, but ways in which it's affecting our politics here in the United States. The war on terror for 20 years has profoundly shaped and transformed American institutions and eroded American democracy. Just as an example, the other week, I think it was like last week, there was a pretty horrific attack in Michigan in a school. And the authorities are charging the perpetrator of that attack with terrorism. Obviously, what the person did was terrible, but we have to ask, why are they charging this person with terrorism? Similarly, last year in the Black Lives Matter protest, there were protesters who were also charged with something equivalent to terrorism. And it's become, this idea of counterterrorism has actually become a tool that's being used by prosecutors and used by different institutions in the United States to erode our democracy, and this has been happening for 2 decades. So these are just ways in which I think we're still living very much in the war on terror paradigm.
Thanks so much, Anand. And you know, it's interesting because another anniversary right now is around this time was 2 months into the war in Afghanistan, right? December 2001, when there was a moment of U.S. victory, tactical victory against the Taliban, and an opportunity to end that war 2 months into the war. But the U.S. did not end the war 2 months in or 2 years in. And now, as you see, even 2 decades later, we're still understanding that next phase. I want to go to you, Lyle. I mean, you have experience with the Marine Corps in Afghanistan, and also your broader analysis in doing research on U.S. militarism and empire. What do you want to say, looking at these 20 years of war? What are a couple points you want to add to the table?
Well, first of all, thanks, Tej. It's a real honor to be on this panel. I've learned a tremendous amount from a number of the people on this panel, and I'm sure I'll learn a lot more today and in the future. So I was both in the military, and I've spent a number of years since I've been out of the military doing counter-recruitment work, where I've gone to schools, mostly populations that are being targeted by the military for recruitment. So everything I say today is going to be heavily shaped by not only my experience in the Marine Corps and my experience in Afghanistan, but just as much by my conversations with a number of these students. First of all, I cannot emphasize enough what Anand just said about the crisis in Afghanistan right now. And I think it speaks to the point that I want to make, which is that media likes to cut up the past, the present, the future into segments. You know, this began at this point, it ended at this point. The war on terror began well before 9/11, and it is going to continue well beyond the formal military withdrawal from Afghanistan. So if there's one point I really want to emphasize, and this is something that comes out again and again in my discussions at these schools, is that these are living pasts and living presents and living futures that we're talking about. I'll just give you one example. A lot of times I speak to students who are refugees from the countries that the United States government and its allies and proxies are warring in. And they are being targeted by the military for recruitment. This is one of many cycles of violence that goes on. And they're being targeted because of their language skills. They speak the languages of the places that these wars are taking place. And this interacts with anti-immigrant politics in this country, because these students have quite a motivation for joining the military because they're being guaranteed citizenship. Their parents, their families are being guaranteed citizenship. And I'm not just talking about students from Yemen or Iraq or Afghanistan. I'm also talking about migrants from Honduras, migrants from El Salvador, and so on. I want to emphasize that, again, that there's a lot of intersecting cycles of violence that are at work, and we need to be conscious of all of them. The one other point I do want to talk about is just trauma. A lot of times when the United States, if it talks about trauma in the context of war, it's talking about the trauma of military veterans. First and foremost, I would like to see more of a discussion about the trauma of the actual people in the countries that we war in. So right now, particularly people in Afghanistan, not just those that have fought in Afghanistan on any side of that war, but of course the civilians. And I also want to move beyond just an individual discussion of trauma. I think we need to talk a lot more about collective trauma and how collective trauma is used. So I actually just used or weaponized by different governments, by different ruling classes. So I just gave one example of this. You have people from Yemen, young people from Yemen, who were traumatized in these wars in Yemen or in Iraq, Afghanistan. They come to America, and then their trauma is used to get them to join the military to continue to fight similar wars. A lot of the Marines that I got to know experienced a whole lot of trauma before they joined the military. And in fact, their trauma in a lot of ways encouraged them to join the military. And I'm talking about all sorts of different kinds of trauma: economic trauma, familial trauma, I would say, a kind of gender trauma. I think a lot of people that join the military want to become men. They need to prove their manhood. And there's reasons for that. There's all sorts of reasons for that. But the way that the military exploits this need on the part of young people, particularly young people that have experienced a lot of violence and other forms of trauma as young people, to convince them that if they pick up a weapon and if they kill other people with that weapon in other countries, that's their ticket to manhood. That's their ticket to some form of security. I think that's something that needs to be mentioned. And on that note, I'll pass it on to the next member of the panel.
Thanks so much, Lau. And that's I want to turn to Summer, who's and what do you want to bring to the table to this conversation in the sort of big picture, and how we can look at it from the entry points that you want to bring to this discussion.
Thanks so much, Tej. I want to thank you for bringing us all together today in conversation. I think it's incredibly important to be making connections across seemingly disconnected geographies in general, but especially when it comes to 20 years of war. So I guess I'd like to think about what it would mean to write Africa and Africans back into the history of post 9/11 imperial warfare. I think it's pretty uncommon that Africa is included in US-based analysis. And if and when it is considered, it's primarily through the lens of great power rivalries. And I think the effect of this is to obscure Africans themselves. So it obscures the role of African states, for example, in facilitating imperial warfare. It obscures the role of African troops who are subcontracted to fight groups like Al-Shabaab in Somalia. And on a day-to-day level, it obscures how people on the ground are affected. Relatedly, I think there's a tendency to approach Africa as a quote unquote newer front in the war on terror. And this ignores histories that predate 9/11. So we could take August 1998 as an example. This was when Al-Qaeda attacked US embassies in Nairobi and Dar es Salaam. It was the first time that Al-Qaeda emerged as a global network. And even as people in the region sought to make sense of what had transpired, and over 200 people were killed in those attacks, the majority of them Kenyans and Tanzanians, those people themselves found that they were the target of scrutiny and suspicion by the US government at the time. So hundreds of FBI agents landed in East Africa to conduct the first ever foreign-led FBI investigations outside of US borders. And what transpired was not dissimilar from what happened after 9/11. Government officials declared quote unquote radical Islam to be a threat, leading to mass arrests and interrogations of Muslims. Meanwhile, President Clinton bombed a pharmaceutical factory in Sudan, claiming with unsubstantiated evidence, that that factory was producing chemical weapons. Now, that factory had been the largest manufacturer of pharmaceuticals in Sudan. They specialized in anti-malarial drugs. And analysts later concluded that the destruction of the factory indirectly contributed to thousands of otherwise preventable deaths. So all this to say that August of 1998 was a significant historical moment for Africans, but has long been forgotten by most Americans. Now, Kenya, around that time, became a site of interest for the US, and the US was quick to court it as a potential partner in the war on terror. And since that time, it's become one of the largest global recipients, and certainly within the African context, one of the largest recipients of US counterterrorism assistance. In that context, Kenya has become imbricated in counterinsurgency tactics at home and in endless war in neighboring Somalia. So in the weeks and months after the US-backed Ethiopian invasion of Somalia in December 2006, and that, mind you, is another anniversary that we're marking this month, 15 years of endless war in Somalia, the Kenyan government at the time worked closely with the Ethiopian and the US governments in the first publicly documented instances of mass rendition in East Africa. Over 100 people were rounded up, including women and children. They were secretly transported to black sites in both Somalia and Ethiopia, where they were interrogated by US and UK officials. Now, keep in mind that the US never officially declared war on Somalia, right? But it was roughly around this time in 2007 that it began to bomb Somalia from the air. When Obama came into office, this is when drone strikes became a common feature of US policy. And under the Trump administration, those drone strikes escalated dramatically. But in many ways, and this is really important, I think drone warfare is only the most visible element of what Madiha Taher would refer to as distributed empire, wherein a whole range of different actors and infrastructures are mobilized to expand the reach of the war on terror. So in Somalia, since 2007, the African Union has been running a quote unquote peacekeeping operation that began as a small deployment of just 1,600 African troops, but gradually expanded to a number that exceeded 22,000. So this dispersal of power, I think, requires some attention on our part to think about the racialized labor that sustains war making in Somalia. It also forces us to think about the effects of this war and how they extend beyond the geography and the territory of Somalia itself. So I'm talking about Kenya, Djibouti, Ethiopia, Kenya, and Uganda. And if we take Kenya as an example, because that's where I've done most of my research, the massive influx of funds has enabled that government to create numerous domestic security bodies that are notorious for disappearances and extrajudicial killings. And it's widely known among Kenyans that security operations are rarely, if ever, about catching so-called terrorists. It's more about the state performing its power in order to suppress political opposition and dissent.
Thanks so much for that, Summer, and that gives us some good context and reference points, as well as analysis of this sort of bigger picture. Judith, what do you want to bring to this discussion, given your sort of observation of war and war politics over these 2 decades, and your participation in different movements, sort of overlapping and intersecting movements in response to this politics?
Well, first, let me start by thanking you so much for inviting me to be a part of this panel and to give us the opportunity to look back on 20 years of war and great, huge, amazing shifts in the world. I think when we look at U.S. foreign policy or the economic conditions that lead to some of our people enlisting in the military, especially in communities of color, we're talking about the needs for some basic systemic change, that no amount of tinkering from the side on foreign policy or around the economy or social conditions are going to make the difference that we need in order to live in a good way, no matter what country we are in. And you and I have spent time at the grassroots trying to popularize the concepts that guide foreign policy in the United States and have since first contact with the colonial countries. I think there are 2 basic and really important impacts that the 20 years of war have had. One is that the first demonstrations, the movement against globalization and the impact of global capital was building great, amazing grassroots political power in many countries across the world. And of course, 1999, we saw the impact of the anti-globalization movement at the World Trade Organization meeting in Seattle. And after September 11th, in direct response, the militarized response was to criminalize protest. And so the movement, the grassroots movement that sprung all across the world to try to prevent the war in Iraq was in fact, I think, has had in fact the most profound long-term impact on world politics. And that is because people understood that war was not the answer to September 11th. People understood at a very fundamental level when we marched on the global day to say no to war on February 11th, people were understanding that our fates were commonly, our future, our ability to change the course of history was linked together and rooted in grassroots organizing. I think that has had a lasting effect over the 20 years in the United States, because you could not have had Black Lives Matter or the Fight for 15, the fast food workers, or the Dreamers, undocumented workers, or Standing Rock without setting a new norm that whenever something is egregious that the government does, then a public outcry signifying in the streets is the norm, despite the conditions. The second lasting effect is that we still do not know how to interrupt the dominant narrative on militarism, be it militarism in foreign policy or militarism in domestic policy. And I think that is a huge conundrum for grassroots organizing and movement building for social change. Unless we connect militarism with not only foreign policy, but its impact on our lives in every country and U.S. militarism in particular, we'll have little opportunity to galvanize the opposition that is needed for system change, nor will we have the possibility of galvanizing those who can put forward in a convincing and politically powerful way what the alternative is to U.S. militarism, unfettered U.S. Militarism wreaking havoc across the globe. So that is our biggest challenge. Our biggest strength is that we did make a difference 20 years ago in mobilizing against the war globally, as well as in the United States. That's had a lasting impact. But we've yet to find a way to challenge the dominant narrative of militarism.
Thanks so much for that, Judith. And I want to ask, and this is sort of, if any of the sort of panelists want to jump in, the way this panel is framed is around this idea of class, race, and global. This idea of looking at the intersections across these, right? And especially when we talk about war, it's often framed as a foreign policy or global issue, where presumably some sort of government or elite deals with another government or elite. But as we've seen already in this discussion, right, the socioeconomic diversities and inequalities within the US, within Afghanistan, within Africa, are also in motion in response to these events. And they create constituencies and coalitions that could potentially be pro-war or anti-war, supporting one side or another side. So I want to throw open, if any of you want to sort of go further down that road and speak to class, race, global, whether you're talking about the US or Kenya or Afghanistan or a connection between them, how can we think about this? How can we make questions about war a sort of race and class and socioeconomic conversation, and not just some kind of high politics, international relations conversation that is insulated from race and class struggles? So any of you can take up that question, or if you want to build on or respond to something somebody else said, that one of your fellow panelists said, this is an opportunity to do that. Anyone want to jump in?
I suppose I will, just real quick. Samar and I were having this conversation earlier, but there's a way in which the military is used to welcome historically oppressed or marginalized or suspect groups into the ruling order, into the white order or the capitalist order, so on and so forth. And Samar, you can speak more to how this is taking place in Africa. But in the military, one of the the easiest ways to prove yourself an American in a very technical sense of earning your citizenship, but also in a figurative sense, is by donning the uniform. And there's all sorts of racialized groups that have taken this path, very understandably. So to the extent that a lot of these, really what we're talking about here is racial capitalism, a capitalism that operates through really racial power relations in this country and globally. As long as that continues to exist, it's going to be very easy for the military to continue to find fresh recruits. And it's going to be very easy for these wars to continue. So much of our economy, going beyond just the recruitment aspect, so much of our economy is based on the war economy in one way or another. We're not just talking about the weapons that are being used abroad. We're talking about a lot of the weapons that are used to police racialized communities across America and the tactics. In Afghanistan, I constantly came across cops who were doing certain training in Afghanistan. There's all sorts of relationships between policing within the United States borders and abroad.
Thanks for that, Lyle. Anybody else want to either sort of build on something somebody else said or sort of go deeper on this sort of class, race, global intersection?
I can jump in. Maybe I'll just start very, very broadly in thinking about the ways in which, when it comes to Africa, we inevitably confront the longstanding pathologizing of the continent as a space of violence and insecurity. And, we've seen painful reminders of this just in the last week in the media's coverage of the South Africa and the Omicron variant. Now, in the last 20 years, this frame of otherness has assumed new meaning as it intersects with discourses of so-called violent Islam. In November 2001, for example, Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs Susan Rice referred to Africa as the world's quote-unquote soft underbelly for terrorism, and she argued that terrorists would be exploiting the quote-unquote weak law enforcement capabilities of African states. And so even though these discourses don't explicitly invoke race, the language of weak and failed states is inevitably informed by and produces racialized ideas about place and space. So I think it's important to situate the racialized figure of the Muslim that has now come to the fore within the broader domain of anti-Blackness that has marked Africa as the quintessential other of the global order. Now, political leaders in Africa, of course, are painfully aware of the ways in which Africa is othered, and this is certainly the case in Kenya, where Kenyan politicians have actively worked to distance themselves from imagined geographies of violence and terror. And as Lyle was just alluding to, I think it's important to make connections here between the ways in which the racialized communities in the United States have been approached by the US military-industrial complex and the ways in which it offers them an entry point, purportedly to integrate into America. We can apply that to Africa at the level of states, right, who are seeking, they're navigating their very precarious position in a racialized global economy and seeking to come out at the top to the extent possible. And so I have observed this of the Kenyan state as it essentially tries to brand itself on the global stage as a leader in the war on terror. So this is how it frames itself vis-a-vis and distinguishes itself from Somalia. And, Kenya itself has a minority ethnic Somali population who are citizens who have experienced longstanding forms of marginalization and discrimination that have been accentuated by the war on terror. But when you weave in an analysis of class and expand the lens beyond the nation state, then the picture starts to look more complicated. The Kenyan government, for example, has appointed ethnic Somalis to top positions, for example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, the Minister of Internal Security, And in this context, these figures are inevitably entangled in and increasingly invested in endless war. So for the past 10 years, since Kenya invaded Somalia in 2011, the salaries of Kenyan troops in Somalia have been paid by foreign donors, primarily by the European Union. And this constitutes just a tiny percentage of the overall military packages that are offered to them, for the role that they're playing. So there's very little incentive to withdraw. It's also worth noting that the Somali government itself welcomed the Kenyan invasion of Somalia in 2011, and for the most part has continued to support the presence of Kenyan troops on its soil. So what we see is a regional capitalist class that has coalesced around what can best be described as the business of war. Last week, Adam Hania emphasized the importance of looking beyond the state to consider regional and transnational dimensions of class formation. And I think here we can think about the fact that many Somali government officials actually live and work from Nairobi. And it's in Nairobi where many of the deals get made. So the project of quote unquote stabilizing Somalia in many ways serves as a cover for violence-driven means of accumulation. And just to give you a few more examples, a lot of top-level Kenyan officials have been found to be pursuing strategic foothold in offshore oil fields. They've been found to be colluding with al-Shabaab in the illicit trade in charcoal and sugar. So we can begin to see how the so-called war on terror has been both facilitated by and used to consolidate the power of the region's political elite. One last point that I want to make on this is to build on an article that Zora Ahmed published last week in the Law and Political Economy Project blog on the importance of interrogating the full range of material conditions that enable endless war. And I think the really important point that she makes is that we have to look at economic policies. So Somalia is heavily dependent on remittances from the diaspora, much of which enters the country annually via informal money transfer systems. Now, the criminalization of these money transfer systems has contributed to a crippling of these life-sustaining remittance economies. Meanwhile, on the flip side of things, purportedly legitimate entities ranging from MasterCard to the Kenya Commercial Bank are capitalizing on the Somali government's readiness to facilitate their entry into Somalia, where only a tiny, tiny percentage of the population relies on private banks. So this is a huge potential market for them. So I think it's here helpful to think about the ways in which economic policies are themselves forms of warfare, right? And to reflect on what it would mean to bring an end to this dimension of endless war.
Thank you for that, Summer. And I think, that also speaks to some of what Anand opened up with about sort of thinking about sort of economic war on Afghanistan that isn't just with guns and bombs. We have a comment from Ryan Novak asking about how is globalization potentially a site and trade a site of geopolitical conflict. And Anna, do you want to say more about that? You've looked at Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. These are places where U.S. power has taken space, as well as Europe, Russia, China, Saudi Arabia, Iran. So how do you see this multi-layered, maybe multipolar military power as well as economic power? And how can we look at how can we imagine economic justice for Afghan people, Iraqi people, Syrian people who are affected by these sort of multi-layered globalization and trade positionalities, not only war, formal war?
Sorry, I'm muted. I said I'll start with Afghanistan on that, which is that, Tej, before you mentioned that we are now at an anniversary of the sort of the tactical victory of the U.S. war in Afghanistan. I think it was actually December 6th or 7th where the U.S. Secured the surrender of the Taliban. So just to take people back to that moment, the U.S. In 2 months basically ran roughshod over the Taliban government in 2001 and instituted a client state. And the Taliban, from the senior leadership down to the rank and file, essentially quit. They surrendered and they went back home because they knew that they were defeated. And at that point, the United States had an option. They could have sort of tried to integrate these ex-Taliban people into the new political order, or they could have excluded them. They chose the latter. What they did is they allied with local warlords, many of whom they brought from outside the country, paid them vast sums of money and said, go find us terrorists. And in many cases, these people either found ex-Taliban or even innocent people who were never Taliban. These people were rolled up, sometimes killed or sent to Guantanamo. And in this process, over 2 or 3 years, this created a groundswell of support for the reconstitution of the Taliban insurgency. So the question is, why did the US do this? I mean, why did the US choose this way to manage Afghanistan? Why did they decide to bring in warlords outside the country when they could have possibly tried to develop a state or build a nation? And the reason goes back to some of the policies around 2001 and 2002. So Rumsfeld, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, one of his sort of visions for remaking American imperial power was to say that the US should shift towards a much leaner force on the ground, outsource most of the violence either to local actors, proxy fighters, or to put it onto air power. And the context of this was that this is already at the point where we've had in the United States 20 years in which the government is being shrunk, where social services were being cut. And the military was kind of the last place in American society that hadn't been affected by this. And so the Rumsfeld doctrine was, in effect, a way to bring this neoliberalization of American society into the military. And so that's where we get what Samar calls the distributed empire, or Mediha calls it distributed empire. This is the underlying impetus to want to outsource so much of the actual violence to other actors. And when we're talking about outsourcing in the Afghan case, a lot of these warlords were essentially private security companies, right? They were functioning as private security companies. They're being paid to kill people, essentially. So most of the functions that previously had been done by US soldiers, such as even things like logistics, cooking, et cetera, all of that was outsourced to other actors. And by doing this, it had two effects. One, this undermined the ability of the Afghan state to kind of cohere. And two, it created this kind of libertarian Mad Max type society in Afghanistan where there was no tax collection whatsoever. Therefore, there was no ability to provide social services. And all social services were provided by NGOs, international NGOs. And that the real power brokers were not the people wearing suits in Kabul, they were gunmen and strongmen who were on American contracts. That's why when the Taliban took over the country, the whole economy collapsed, because this was a kind of consequence of that. So the kind of connection between that form of neoliberalism and what we've experienced here is, of course, that form of neoliberalism has also immiserated poor and working class people over the last 40 years. And so even though there's like really major differences, obviously, in living standards between a working class American and an Afghan farmer, in a kind of surprising way, both have been subjected to the same forces of globalization and neoliberalism, which have immiserated them in different manners.
Thank you for that, Anand. And we see some resonances between Lyle's comments, Samar's comments, and Anand's comments, both from the standpoint of people that are sort of under the gun of war, but also employed at various levels, on the gun holding side of things across these different but sort of intersecting contexts. Judith, I want to turn to you. We have a couple of questions that have come in, one from Mary Ames, one from Dave, specifically looking at sort of the way a warfare paradigm is connected to domestic repression, literal state repression, as well as sort of putting a chill on political debate and political discussion. So Dave asks about, in the Cold War period, and then the war on drugs, and now the war on terror, what continuities can we see in sort of silencing political opposition, political alternatives? Mary Ames asks sort of, how can we shift away from this sort of war on terror paradigm to advance sort of civil rights and human rights at home? So if you want to sort of speak to that, and specifically, you've been doing organizing with different specific Native and Indigenous communities and across different Native and Indigenous communities that have faced both sort of literally, the Army Corps of Engineers and other forms of military apparatus, as well as sort of a broader sort of machinery of state power at home. So I wonder if you have any insights from Native organizing about sort of both political repression as well as possibilities of forging broader coalitions for an alternative politics.
Well, I think Lyle and Samar elevated the core issue, and that is racial capitalism, exploitation, war profiteering, and the corporate domination of every area of life. And that poverty is really the driving force, be it in military recruitment or those who knowingly work for military production corporations, or for that matter, how people rationalize othering, how people rationalize the idea of children being killed in wars. And I think the impact of the warfare paradigm on communities of color, but Native communities especially, has had a long-term impact on the way that people view the government. So 10% of the boots on the ground in the initial invasion in Iraq were American Indians. We're 3% in the population. The first U.S. woman to die was an American Indian woman, a single parent. Poverty draft. People enlisting in a military where there is still rampant discrimination, and in some ways, in Native culture, there's been a certain glorification of being in the military. You can't go to a cultural event without the veterans being honored. And I think that our biggest problem, therefore, is the interpretation of U.S. history from first contact on. And the truth is that in Native, our relationship to the federal government was not all about wars. There was also treaty making, sometimes with equal power, but many times without. And wars in this country, on this land, have been conducted for the same reasons why they've been launched in other countries, and that is exploitation, profiteering, and expanding the empire. The Civil War was not ended, we know that, by Abraham Lincoln. It was a combination of factors, which included the slave revolts, included the white anti-slavery organizing, and it included the economy, and the fact that war was so costly, and they had bigger fish to fry. They wanted to expand the land base of the United States into the West, and could not turn the militarism towards the West, although there were massacres going on during the Civil War. Same roots. And this history, which has been covered up, is something that is an impediment for us who want to reveal the true nature of racial capitalism. And I think the Native communities have a big role to play in reinterpreting and making a contribution to really clarifying what U.S. history really was all about and why, the socioeconomic as well as racial aspects to U.S. foreign policy and its relationship to sovereign Native nations. But it will help to reveal what it is that continues the foreign policy we see now, in the sense of a lack of respect for sovereignty, national sovereignty, the undermining of democracy. The anti-war movement is in essence a pro-democracy movement. Those who fight against militarism are fighting for democratic rights to live, to love, to exist. And wars have been an interruption to the continuity of people striving for civil rights, for the right for freedom all across the world. And the truth is that without an end to war, we will not be able to achieve many basic human needs, achieve meeting basic human needs. So wars are an interruption, and after 20 years, we see that there's a lasting impact of the wars. But the truth is that we're in the middle of another huge interruption, and that is COVID, a pandemic. And the reason why we can't make headway on ending this pandemic globally is because of militarism, of wars, of the U.S. military-industrial complex. And so I think the warfare paradigm and shifting away and revealing the impact that it has on culture, on the economy, and on politics is critical. And I don't think that there is a direct relationship between the Army Corps of Engineers and how they react to the building of a pipeline and the resistance to the building of a pipeline. But what we do know is that the control of land is militarized, that the Army Corps of Engineers controls the waterways, and that sovereign nations, tribal nations, who have treaties with the U.S. government are not allowed to prevent the destruction of land and water, not just for ourselves, but for all who live, drink, play, work along the shores of, for example, the Missouri River during the Dakota Access Pipeline. So it's not just simply militarism. It is also about national sovereignty. It is also about how the government is driven by corporate domination.
Thanks so much for that, Judith. And that really kind of puts into relief some of the reference points, especially, when we want to think about sort of what constitutes the United States and how the United States came into being and is still coming into being in both sort of forces of colonization as well as forces of sovereignty, of life-giving, and of sort of a different kind of way of people living with each other and living with nature as well. Particularly, we now have a conversation, as you mentioned, the coronavirus pandemic has raised a certain conversation about crisis and historic crisis. And of course, we have the climate crisis. And in the climate conversation, there's this idea of a just transition, this idea that, on the one hand, we can't just accept that so we're fated to climate catastrophe. But on the other hand, we can't just flip a switch and have a whole new global economy overnight either. That there are sort of frontline impacted communities. And then there's also communities that they may not be the most impacted, the most impoverished, but that are sort of entrenched in a carbon economy, right? And we need to find ways to transition them. People who work in coal or oil sectors, and find ways to not just say it'll all work out, but to have specific plans. And I wonder if any of you sort of think, if we have this shared analysis here of racial capitalism and an entrenched sort of global economic order where differentiation within countries, between countries, within the US, within Asia or Africa, and as well as between sort of entrenches people in these sort of multi-layered hierarchies. What do you see any glimpses of visions of a just transition? Whether it's for Afghanistan, Iraq, or Syria, whether it's for Kenya or Somalia, whether it's for the United States, against militarization of different kinds, against war of different kinds, where most impacted and harmed communities have a vision for a just transition, or communities that might be in that coalition of war, so to speak, that might be employed by military service or the military-industrial complex in the U.S. or in a parallel way in another place, can have another vision. Do you see any glimpses or examples of advocacy, analysis, activism, political projects, or even ideas towards what that can look like in this decade, the 2020s, so we can when we come to 2031, we feel like we've moved the ball, either for one specific country or more than one. Just transition from this sort of racial capitalist order. Any examples or insights? Anybody?
Yeah, I have two thoughts. Before I go to them real quickly, I neglected to mention the name of the counter recruitment organization that I work with. They're called We Are Not Your Soldiers. So if anyone is interested in counter recruitment work, I encourage you to look them up. The first idea that comes to mind is a war tax. Bernie Sanders supported a war tax a number of years ago, but I think it went by the wayside. But I actually think there's a way in which you can connect a demand for a war tax, which is basically either taxing war profiteers and then redirecting that revenue to whatever we, the people, decide to redirect that revenue to, or in Sanders' plan, it was actually taxing all very rich people with the argument they all profited in one way or another by America's wars, and then redirecting that revenue. So I think this is, even if it's not a feasible demand at the moment, I think it's a useful demand that can get people to think differently and to integrate the conversation of militarism into these other problems, particularly the climate crisis. And of course, the demand would be redirecting all these profits to a global Green New Deal or something of that kind. And just to dovetail off that, I think thinking in a kind of Marxian sense or dialectical sense about institutions, there's a lot of institutions that have been created in the process making of racial capitalism. There's the World Bank, there's the World Trade Organization, there's the United States military, there's all the other militaries that are one way or another working for or beside the US military. And they have tremendous power. They also have tremendous logistical frameworks in which they're operating. And I think there is a possibility that these institutions could be used in very different ways, in opposite ways. So instead of exacerbating conflict, instead of exacerbating racial capitalist power relations, they could be used to do the reverse. If you were to have a shift in personnel, miraculously in the World Bank, a lot of the relationships that they now have, a lot of the way that they pass money from one place to another, a lot of ways that they surveil the way capital movements from one place to another could be used to fight the climate crisis, and could be used to develop more healthy futures. So I'll leave it at that.
Anyone else want to jump in on sort of visions of a just transition, or just build on a comment somebody else has made?
I can jump in, and I'll start just by thanking Lyle for sharing the name of the group, We Are Not Your Soldiers. And I think it would be fantastic if you think there are openings to put some of the folks involved with your organizing in conversation with troops in Kenya and from other African countries that have been serving in Somalia, because some of them have, again, it's been 10 years for the Kenyan military. In other cases, countries have had a longer presence in Somalia. So that's a significant period of time, and many of these troops are coming home with PTSD. And when they seek assistance in the Kenyan context for their trauma, they're actually thrown in jail. So I think there's a lot of room for raising awareness and some organizing there. I do want also to take this moment to recognize the activists in Kenya in particular who have been at the forefront of documenting the disappearances, the extrajudicial killings. They have paid an incredible high price for their activism, for daring to ask questions. So in 2007, a group called the Muslim Human Rights Forum was at the forefront of tracking what happened to all of the people, the over 100 people who disappeared and were renditioned to the Black sites that I mentioned in Somalia and Ethiopia. And essentially, they did the groundwork of documenting, literally going, police station to police station, and providing just basic information for families who had lost their loved ones, and eventually for Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to document what was going on at the time. Now, some of these people who were involved in that documentation have themselves been accused of ties to terrorism, and in some cases imprisoned for 1 year, in another case 6-7 years. And while I was in Kenya in 2014, 2015 for an extended period of research, two prominent human rights organizations, Haki Africa and Muhuri, were suddenly placed on a list of entities with purported ties to al-Shabaab. Now, on a the legal front, this meant that their bank accounts were frozen and they were effectively rendered inoperable. But I think perhaps more significant than the legal dimension are the forms of fear and paranoia that increasingly pervade activist spaces, to the point where there are fewer and fewer spaces to have critical discussion and debate. The framework of countering violent extremism now has completely taken over the donor industry. And this has had numerous effects. There are virtually no funds available to do anything other than counterterrorism. And people in the region are effectively encouraged to monitor and spy on one another, which feeds into social distrust and contributes to the policing of dissent. Now, what does this mean for activism? On the ground in Kenya, the two of the groups that I just mentioned, Haki Africa and Muhuri, do continue to be very active. Muhuri just filed a Freedom of Information Act request in coordination with the Center for Constitutional Rights and NYU Law School regarding the US's involvement in extrajudicial killings and disappearances by the CIA-trained Rapid Response Police Force and other police and military forces. In Nairobi, the Mathare Social Justice Center does incredibly important work documenting forced evictions, as well as police abuse. And I think the work of each of these organizations is crucial because it points to the connections between war and policing. Their efforts to expose police abuse forces us to confront the reality that targeted operations are unfolding not only in Somalia, but equally in purportedly peaceful urban centers like Nairobi and Mombasa, Kampala, Dar es Salaam. But with that said, we have yet to see a significant anti-war movement that scrutinizes and challenges the ongoing war in Somalia, including the role of African governments in sustaining this war. So I think one of the challenges now is how to trace the changing formations of power that are at work. So just before Trump left office, he withdrew US troops from Somalia. And when Biden came in, he imposed temporary limits on drone strikes outside of quote unquote conventional battlefield zones. So that included Somalia. But this hasn't meant an end to the bombing of Somalia. Kenya, Ethiopia, and Uganda have each conducted their own aerial assaults against al-Shabaab. And even though each one of these countries are formal allies of the United States, I think we can't reduce their actions simply to the idea that they're just following US directives, because the ability of these states to maintain their own war-making projects requires the active or tacit collaboration of all kinds of people in their respective countries, whether it's the politicians, whether it's the media houses, and the troops themselves. And the last point that I just wanted to make is that I think we also need to account for the growing role of Turkey and the Gulf states in the region. In Somalia, the UAE and Qatar have been providing weapons or military training to rival political factions, which has exacerbated divisions. And so all this to say that I think if the focus of our anti-war efforts is limited to the US, then we fail to reckon with the reality that this is a terrain shaped by wider modes of power.
Thanks for that very much. Yeah, Anna, do you want to jump in on any of those threads that are sort of in the air?
Sure. The authorization for the use of military force, there's two of them from 2001 after 9/11 and one in 2003. The 2003 one was scrapped, which is, I think, a very positive development, because it was one of the ways in which the US could legally and politically justify kind of unending war. But the more important one after 9/11 is still on the books. And there are, I think, pretty important efforts to try to at least push back on that, because the US has been using this for things that are very tenuously related to the original mission, whether it's Yemen or wherever else. A deeper problem here, though, and I think a kind of a challenge that we should all kind of set ourselves to try to see how to try to meet is, how do we make war making a subject of democratic control instead of having where it is right now, which is purely in the realm of politicians or technocrats. And that's so much of what's happened in the last 2 decades, is that war has been removed from most sections of American society, except for poor and working class communities, especially of color, who are the ones who are being targeted for recruitment. For the majority of American society, most people don't know what's happening in East Africa or what's happening in Afghanistan. And that's a fundamentally different state of affairs than, let's say, the Vietnam War or the Korean War, where the American empire affected every single person directly in a tangible way. It still affects people in ways that they don't necessarily see, but people could be subject to being drafted. Everybody knew somebody who was serving in the military. Today, and this is partly, I think, a reaction to the U.S. defeat in Vietnam, is the U.S. has reorganized its war-making capacity in order to be able to continue to have forever wars, so that most portions of the population don't actually see the direct effects of the conflict. And so I think we need to think about ways that we can return war making to democratic control. And here I would just include a lot of well-meaning actors like NGOs, Amnesty International, et cetera, who are doing some good work, but also are, I think, inadvertently part of this process where they're making war a technocratic issue. It's all about looking at the legal sort of constraints of war. Is this airstrike or is this drone strike a war crime or not a war crime? Whereas we don't talk about, should we be going and bombing, whether by a drone or a manned aircraft, some other country for whatever purpose? Those are the conversations that are not happening whatsoever. And I think there are some initial steps towards trying to push against that. I think Bernie and others have done that around the Yemen war. I think we have a much longer way to go, but I think that is an important target for us to set our sights on.
I would just like to add that I totally agree with that, and also the point that Sama made about the fact that we can't just look at one war. We have to look at the forever wars and what's driving that, both internally in the countries as well as the role of the U.S., which is our primary responsibility. But short of system change, there are structural reforms that have to be fought for. And when I say fought for, I mean we have to do cultural and values narrative work and initiatives. We have to do narrative change work to at least get people to question the rationales, and we have to do organizing. We have to be in the places where people are talking about their lives, so that those connections can be made about what's going on in the country where a bombing just happened, and to have people informed enough to be able to talk with people, everyday people. And the truth is that COVID has created an opportunity, which is now being again twisted around, that people did have an aha moment last year, that the health of people in Wuhan is as important as the health of the person who drives the bus or the person who works in the grocery store and our families. And so there is some shift in popular thinking about our relationship globally, but not enough. I think for many people, the missed opportunity is often the electoral arena. And frankly, we're not going to vote our way out of war policy. We're not going to vote our way out of COVID or climate crisis. But what we can do is to use the electoral arena to call the questions, and that's why Bernie it has been a very important factor, a very important personality, a very important movement around his candidacy has not continued in the way that it should, around policy questions, around doing the not so glamorous work of being embedded in our communities and calling the questions about why wars? Why not negotiation? Why is the military budget the highest ever and we don't have enough money to make sure that everybody's guaranteed health care or preschool, pre-K for all toddlers in this country? And so I think that the 2022 elections, the midterm elections, again, a really important arena. We found that around Obama. I mean, the anti-war movement moved into a wholehearted push to, number one, to bird dog McCain, to get him to say what he said about staying in Afghanistan for as long as it takes for 100 years, which helped to undercut the support for him, because even people who were in the Republican Party did not want to see a forever war. There were people in the Republican Party who actually voted for Obama. They called them Republicans. One of my brothers, I come from a military family, one of my brothers was a Republican and convinced one Republican a week to vote for Obama. But the truth is this, that I think the work that you all are doing is very important to help educate people about what's really going on the ground. But in the end, it's good old-fashioned. What are we organizing? How are we using culture and values? And what are we doing towards changing the dominant narrative about militarism? I'm optimistic, but then I've been doing this for about 50 years. But I think that there's opportunities at this moment where there's such a polarized atmosphere that we can get more people to question the narrative, because we have more people who are thinking, oh my God, democracy is at stake. And the truth is that being anti-war is pro-democracy.
Thanks so much for that, Judith. And I think that kind of leads us to sort of maybe an opportunity for sort of any closing remarks. If anybody, first of all, wants to tell us about your own work, if there's any way we can stay tuned to your work, whether it's a piece of writing you want to highlight or an organization. And then also, if you want to, we've had some of this already, but if you want to draw attention to any sort of voices or protagonists that we should pay attention to, whether it's on this kind of narrative change perspective or advocacy and activism perspective. So, if everybody wants to go around once, and then I'll take moderator to go last. Just again, anything we can do to stay attention to your writing or organization, and then any other organizations or voices you want to draw attention to, especially from these sort of frontline communities. Who wants to jump in?
All right, I guess I will. So I'll start with recommendations. One of the things I am looking forward to with the formal military exit of the United States is the emergence of Afghan voices and also in art and in literature and hopefully in politics as well in the United States. I know there was an organization that tweeted something. They're called Afghans for a Better Tomorrow. So there are a lot of these organizations exist that are trying to platform. In that case, it's the Afghan diaspora. Anand's book, No Good Men Among the Living, I would highly recommend that when it comes to, at least as a starting point for elevating the voices of Afghans that are still in Afghanistan or recently in Afghanistan. Yeah, I mean, I taught a course on the Vietnam War, and it was incredible the amount of voices that came forward after the American exit. The literature, the Vietnamese literature, and also the diaspora literature in the United States and elsewhere. So I am looking forward to that. The one point I do want to make is one about national interest. We hear that term a lot, and I think, throughout this conversation, one of the themes has been that there really is no national interest. There's all sorts of different interests. They're always in flux. They're always changing. When I was in Afghanistan, in the intelligence community, a lot of the people that I was being tasked with targeting were assets of other aspects of the intelligence community. They were assets or informants of the CIA. So there isn't, you know, I also often think of when I was teaching the Vietnam War, the relationship of the United States with the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, which most Americans have no idea about. That's just one of many examples of how you know, it's usually not a clear-cut story of America versus Afghanistan or America versus the Taliban or the United States versus you know, the Viet Cong or what have you. You know, we really need to move beyond this discourse of national interest.
Anybody else want to jump in, sort of things we can stay tuned to, pay attention to?
I can jump in briefly. I did speak earlier about some of the groups in East Africa that have been most vocal. So I'd actually like to just build upon one of the comments that Anand made and that Judith also was in dialogue with, and that is observation about essentially the nonprofit industrial complex and the ways in which it depoliticizes many of these conversations and kind of pushes us towards legal frames of analysis. And I would argue that that's fundamentally part of the problem, especially in the East African context. When I said that we have yet to see the emergence of an anti-war movement, it has a lot to do with the fact that many of the groups that are active are operating within the NGO sphere and primarily turn to the law, right, as their primary tool of advocacy, and for important reasons, right, and in many cases with good effect. But the effect as well of kind of being ensconced in this nonprofit industrial complex is oftentimes kind of a tunnel vision. It reinforces methodological nationalism. There's, you know, it's rare that people are looking beyond their own territorial borders to make connections with what's going on elsewhere. And all this to say that this kind of conversation that we're having today, I think, is unusual. And I wanted to thank you again, Tej, for convening us, because we have to move beyond these kind of more legal, technocratic approaches to these conversations. Thanks.
Anand or Judith, any final comments for today's event?
Sure. Well, thanks again for having us. And I'll just say very quickly that I feel very fortunate because I've been able to learn a lot from the places that I've reported on or people I've met. Like, for example, in Afghanistan, I think it was only by living in and going to Afghanistan that I began to understand how individualistic our own culture in the United States was and how that can lead to all sorts of social pathologies which are harmful. And so that's something I'm grateful to Afghans for teaching me. And then I work a lot now in Syria, and in the context of Syria, this is a situation in which there was basically a war on terror that was waged by the regime there against its population, the population who wanted to have some form of self-determination or democratic control. So it was also very instructive to me to look at the sort of democratic forms that emerged in the course of that uprising, which helped me understand a little bit more about the inadequacies of our own sterile democracy and the ways in which people were trying to reimagine different ways of democratic practice in Syria. There's a great book called Burning Country by two people of Syrian extraction that I would recommend people check out to learn more about this. And then finally, just on talking about the war on terror, the ways in which the war on terror has eroded our own democracy. I think there's a lot of great journalism here by people who are from the communities that are the most affected, that are able to articulate really well what this has done to all of us. It's not just to Muslims, Arabs and Muslims. It's like, it's hurt democracy for everybody in the United States, the war on terror. The work of Rosina Ali, who I think was on the panel last week, is a great example of this. So I'd encourage people to check that out.
So I really appreciate being a part of this conversation. And I think that it's really important for us to realize that it's about power. It's about shifting the power back into the hands of the people, no matter what country, and globally. I mean, I think one of the losses that came from 20 years of war was the disintegration of the anti-globalization movement. I mean, that was a movement that was building power globally challenging corporate interests, challenging the role of the World Bank and other international institutions that have been controlled by U.S. interests, U.S. corporate interests. And so we know that power is not defined by borders, and the shifting of that power should not be either. That it is really important that we find ways to build this global solidarity that was so much at the heart and at the center of the founding of the anti-globalization movement and then the anti-war movement back in the 2000s. I also think that it's never been about good guys versus bad guys. That's the commentary. That's the dominant narrative about war. That's militarism's rationale. There's good guys, there's bad guys. You gotta pick a side. And I really urge people to think more closely about how it is that they follow the news and to dig deeper. I know academics, they study and they drill down into specific areas, but generally speaking, we have to think about what's happening to the people, the grassroots, what is new and emerging, what are the sentiments, and to really push ourselves to look at changing the path we're on from that vantage point. I would be remiss if I did not call out two organizations that I think people should follow. One is Common Defense. They grew out of the Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who I worked with 20 years ago, shared an office with them, and began to work with the Goldstaff families right in the very beginning when things were very difficult for the veterans. And they have grown into, I'm the chair of their board, they've grown into a powerhouse where they are organizing veterans on a day-to-day basis to get their voices heard when it comes to policies of militarism and the growth of the right-wing terrorist, homegrown terrorists that we're facing right now. I also would encourage you to follow my own organization, the Native Organizers Alliance. You know, in Indian country, our outlook on life, and when I was the co-chair of United for Peace and Justice for those several years, I was always bringing to the table and into the conversation Native leaders, tribal leaders, traditional leaders, and the grassroots groups that were developing alongside the peace movement in response to the incredible impact of the wars in our communities. But what we're going through now is a cultural and spiritual journey to redefine what warrior means. And our warrior cultures are very strong. The fight to defend, to protect, and our cultures, our languages, our land have gone on since time immemorial. But we have to redefine it in the 21st century. It's about the environmental crisis, it's about the pandemic, it's about the endless wars. And that warrior culture really has to become what it's always been, which is to stand in balance, to think holistically, to understand being in relationship to one another and the natural world, to be in relationship with the peoples on the ground in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, and so on. So I encourage you to learn more about the Native Organizers Alliance. We're a grassroots national organizing and training network. But I also would really encourage people to really begin to think about politics from the vantage point of standing in the strength of our values, and to understand that we can utilize and stand in balance with our values to challenge the power, to fight the power, as we used to say back in the old days, the good old days, and to also understand that we have the power to change things. And if we lose that hope, no matter how much knowledge we have, it won't change what is a fundamental problem of war and peace, and how peaceful coexistence is necessary. It's possible, but it is necessary.
Thank you so much for that, Judith. And this has been a fantastic discussion, and I feel very, very fortunate to have it. I'll just take 2 minutes just to wrap up. I want to draw out a couple of things. Anand talked about efforts to repeal the authorization for use of military force of 2001, and there are such efforts on that front. The National Defense Authorization Act, the defense budget, is currently being debated, and there are provisions about the Saudi war on Yemen and other provisions being fleshed out that you can pay attention to different advocacy about. We've also seen in this conversation attention to different frontline groups and communities, whether it's diaspora groups, Afghans for a Better Tomorrow, the Iraqi Transnational Collective, and other diaspora groups, veterans organizations like Common Defense, like About Face, Veterans Against the War. And so we can think about that sort of in this mapping of coalitions of anti-war, if that's what we're looking towards. And I would encourage people that are watching to read Lyle's articles in N+1 magazine and elsewhere, and stay tuned for his book. Read Anand's articles in the New Yorker and the New York Times. Read his book on Afghanistan, and stay tuned for his book on Syria. Read Samar's articles in Africa's a Country and Al Jazeera, and stay tuned elsewhere, and stay tuned for her book, and stay tuned to Judith's work with the Native Organizers Alliance, another frontline force in that sort of vision of both value change and system change, both the sort of ideological and the infrastructural, in that holistic sense that I think this conversation really got to. I want to thank again the Einaudi Center for International Studies, the American Studies Program, the ILR School, and eCornell for supporting this event. If you enjoyed this event, you can share the link on eCornell with other people. And like I said, there was an event last week with Rosina Ali and others that you can watch that event on eCornell, and today's event also on eCornell. So please do share this event with other people, and you can stay tuned to eCornell's website as well as Class Race Global on Twitter for subsequent events that I'll be organizing next year on history and politics, bringing together scholars, journalists, and activists on a host of issues, sort of both looking at top-down systems and sort of bottom-up social movements, whether they be labor movements, feminist movements, movements against criminal justice repression, linking the foreign and the domestic, and linking an analysis of class, race, as well as gender, religion, that we had to have a certain branding that we couldn't list all the intersections, but the framing is that class, race, global perspective that, as we've seen, cuts down to the big political questions and everyday life in Afghanistan, Kenya, Somalia, Iraq, and all walks of life in the United States, native, non-native, and a whole spectrum of these visions of facing this sort of racial capitalist history and living history, and these sort of visions of transition and alternatives. So this has been really fantastic. I want to thank Lyle, Anand, Samar, and Judith, and I hope that we all stay in touch, and I hope that people watching this event can stay tuned to our work and this sort of living conversation. Thank you so much, everybody.